Hello and welcome to Value Scales and Spheres. My name is Eric. Today we're going to be using our nicer drawing paper to develop 3 different value scales and 3 different spheres with a light source and value transitions. As you can see here, I have my 18 by 24 inch drawing paper. It's a little bit small, but you can see it here. That is the larger pad that you are required to have for this class, and it is the drawing paper. Not the newsprint. This is a nicer drawing. We're going to be using a more substantial piece of paper. So let's go ahead and get this open. Quick note, guys, you can either work in your spiral or you can rip it out. Sometimes people will kind of freak out with the perforation. I'm going to give you sort of a quick demo here. Don't worry about this first fold here. You will be able to rip this perforation out. And don't go slow. Sometimes people come over here and they try and do little movements to rip the page and they get worried and it rips the page in a bad way. So what I usually do is I'll just take it and confidently take it out. That's an easy way of getting that. And you can work with the perforation or you can take it off right now just by folding it a few times and it'll come right off. Either way works, but I do like to take those pages out. And if you're ever wanting to actually present work, or if you had to turn work in, that would be how you would do it. Okay, so I just clamp it down here. I'm actually not clamping it on the page. Once again, I'm going to be ripping it off here, so I'm going to have a little bit of space there for some of my measurements, because some of these measurements are going to be fairly specific. So here we go. This is what we are going to be trying to emulate. This entire page here. Now, as you see here, we have, once again, 3 value scales and 3 spheres with light source and cast shadows. This assignment is going to be focused on following directions. Much of the assignments up till now have been fairly open-ended. Almost any kind of subject matter, as long as you're drawing for an allotted amount of time. And I've gotten a wide variety of objects and observations, which has been good. But this, once again, is sort of about following directions. And I'm going to be sort of looking at these drawings fairly meticulously to try and see if you've done your measurements properly. One of the important elements of this class, drawing 1, is draftsmanship and trying to get something clean and draw it how you want it. This drawing is a few years old, a little bit of wear and tear, but we are going to be attempting to keep our drawings as clean and as organized as possible. So let's take a look here. First thing I want to do is make sure my page is actually 18 by 24 inches. Just to make sure here. Sometimes they're not perfect. 24, very close. 18 looks good too. Okay, so that's the most important thing. I want centralized on the 24-inch axis 3 10-inch wide grayscales that are perfectly centered and they are 2 inches tall. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to draw a quick sketch. I'm a very visual person. I would rather get a sketch so I can see things more easily. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to sketch my idea. I've got a rectangle, represents my page. I know that this is 24 inches. I know that this is 18 inches. 24, 18. Okay, so I'm attempting to get a space of 10 inches perfectly centered on 24 inches. So if I take 10 from 24, I get 14. 10 from 24, I get 14. Divided by 2 is 7. So that means I have 7 inches of negative space here, 7 inches of negative space here, 7, 7, which would give me 10 inches on the center, 10 inches, with 7 inches of negative space on either side. So let's verify this is correct. I come in, right at 7, that looks good. Right at 7, that looks good. Okay, so from here, we're going to start making some lines and some measurements. I'm going to do it on here first, then we're going to do it on the larger page. Once I have that 7-inch border, I need to be thinking about space between my grayscales. So to start out, I want a 2-inch border at the top. Then I want each of the grayscales to be 2 inches tall with 1 inch negative space in between. So on this line, I'm going to be making hatch marks. One at 2, one at 4, 5, 7, 8, and 10. Once I draw that vertical line 7 inches in from the edge. I'll do the same thing on the other side. I'm going to come over on the line that I just drew, 7 inches, and I'm going to make marks at 2, 4, 5, 7, 8, 10. I'm then going to connect them. Once again, those numbers are 2. Let's get it one more time. Make sure we're here. 2, 4, 5, 7, 8, and 10. So I'm writing those down as well. Okay, so those are going to be my first steps. So let's give this a go. Fresh page. I'm coming in from the side. Somewhere centralized. My page is 24 inches. I get a good measurement here. I'm going to make a mark at 7 inches. I'm going to move up. Make another mark at 7 inches. One thing to keep in mind is that do not measure from anywhere here. You want to measure right at that line, that perforation, because that's where it's going to rip. So both of those are at 7 inches. I'm going to turn my ruler over so I get a nice clean line, 7 inches. Then I'm going to come from the other side and do the same thing. 7 inches here. Keep in mind a ruler will sometimes have negative space here. That is not measured. This is where the inch starts. So give it there. Oop. Another 7 inches here, moving on down. Turn it over to get a nice clean line. Make sure those dots connect. So this should be 10 inches in between. Bam, bam, looking good, 10 inches. So now we're going to we've made our vertical lines here. Now we're going to measure the tops and bottoms of our grayscales. Once again, those numbers are going to be 2, 4, 5, 7, 8, and 10. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come to the top of my page. I'm going to line it up with the vertical mark that I just did. Make sure it goes all the way to the top. Remember, the top of the ruler, it's not where it starts, it's that first line. I'm going to go 2, 4, 5, 7, 8, and 10. Looking good. Same thing on this side. I'm going to go all the way to the top. Make sure I'm lined up. 2, 4, 5, 7, 8, and 10. And now all we're going to do is connect the dots once again. 2. I always turn my ruler metal side down when I'm actually making my marks. Oop, that went a little bit low. It's all right, we'll clean it up here in a second. This is 2, 4. That's 5. This is 7. Remember, these are inches from the top that I'm counting. This is 8. And this is 10. Okay, we're looking good. There are some stray marks. We're not going to worry about that yet. We have one more really important measurement. And that measurement is going to be the vertical marks that break up my transitions. So they are 10 inches wide. What I want is 10 1-inch transitions that we will use to develop our value scales. So how I'm going to do this is I'm going to come back to the bottom here. I'm going to find that I'm at 10 inches. I'm looking good. I'm just going to lay my ruler down. And I'm going to mark every inch. All the way through. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Obviously 10 is that border there. Come all the way to the top. Do it again. Guys, this is a little meticulous and a little specific. Once again, draftsmanship is important. If you have a client with very specific wants or needs, it's important to be able to have the control to be able to do that. Okay, we have every inch marked off. I turn my ruler upside down and I make my marks. Now, I personally like to do this fairly light because I am going to be reducing lines in between. But I like to be, or I like to work as quickly as possible and then just sort of clean up after myself. Sometimes people, when they get into drafting and they get into more specifics, they really slow down. They don't trust the measurements. They don't trust the ruler. They haven't used a ruler a lot. Trust the measurements, keep moving. What do they say? Measure twice, cut once, something like that. We're not cutting anything. But the other thing is that graphite is obviously much more forgiving than a cut. If it's not perfect, you can come back in, continue to refine space. Getting close here. Okay, all I'm going to do now is take my eraser, come in and erase all of these stray marks. And when I come back in, I'll be ready to start thinking about more accurate grayscales and actually trying to match value with different mediums. Okay, we're back. What I've done is I've taken my eraser and I've cleaned up the stray marks around my grayscales. And I've taken a liner. This one is a Winsor & Newton brand. Micron makes a really good liner as well. It's a felt tip artist pen, and I've sort of just traced my lines to make them easier to see. This is not a required step to use your liner, but it is required either way to take your pencil and clean up those lines as you go. One quick note, if your eraser is super dirty and you're trying to keep your page super clean, there's a couple ways of cleaning your eraser. One of the easiest ways, I'm going to do this over here so I don't get it all over my drawing, is just taking my finger and just rubbing the eraser. And you'll be surprised with just a little bit of work how quickly you can get some of that residue off your eraser, especially if you're working with charcoal, which we were just working with charcoal, and you only have one eraser. The other way is you can sort of distinguish one eraser for charcoal and one for graphite, and that can help too. But cleaning your eraser a little bit of maintenance can actually help it survive longer too. So keep that in mind. If you came in with your eraser and it got a little bit more dirty, do some cleaning and you'll be all right. Okay, so what we're going to be trying to do is once again emulate this here. And we're going to be starting to develop these grayscales with different mediums as we start through this drawing. So the top scale is going to be graphite. The middle scale is going to be charcoal. And the third scale is going to be hatching, cross-hatching, and or scribble tones to develop value structure. We'll talk a little bit more when we get there, but this would be hatching, cross-hatching, which would be when you go the other direction, and a scribble tone to develop value would be like the sphere here. But we'll get there. So we're going to start with our graphite sphere. There's a couple of recommendations I have for keeping your page clean. I'm going to be using 1-inch painter's tape here. The good thing about if you have 1-inch tape is you can put it right between your two grayscales and make it work. If your tape is a little bit larger, you just have to block off one at a time. One thing that I do like to do with tape, which is a little bit odd, is I like to de-tack the tape. Sometimes if you put the tape down, it holds for an extended period of time. It can actually pull part of the pulp of your page up, which is frustrating when you get a rip in your page. So what I like to do is I'll just take my finger and sort of just rub it down the tape. I'm also making sure my finger is clean before I do this. If not, you'll transfer a bunch of medium onto your tape, which is no good. That takes just a little bit of that stickiness off. And put it right there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to line it up with the top one. Seeing that my space isn't perfect, but that's okay. And I'm going to do the same thing above that. So we're doing that graphite one first. I'm just taking my fingers, reducing some of the stickiness on that tape to hopefully reduce the chance of pulling the pulp of my page. Using tape is not necessarily a required step. Some people work very slowly, very carefully, and don't need tape. I personally prefer it. I think it helps get me into space. I am going to unfortunately have to retape for charcoal. That's okay. Okay, so for graphite, as you can see in our example here, the left side of our grayscale is going to be the tone of the page. The right side of our grayscale is going to be our deepest value that we can develop. We are going to attempt to develop 10 transitions. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, excuse me, I guess 10 would be to that white, or to a full blank page, from white, a pure white, to a darkest value, which we consider a pure black. And then transition each step evenly. Now this can be fairly difficult, but there's ways of making it easier. First thing I'm going to recommend is starting with your deepest value in your graphite, which is going to define that darkest value. So I'm going to get my highest B, which mine is a 9B, and I'm going to come in, I'm going to start to develop value. Now when you're trying to push the deepest value, do not come in and just press as much pressure as you can. What that's going to do is it's actually going to crease your page and make it more difficult to develop a nice deep value. So you notice that I'm coming in, I'm really not even putting that much pressure yet. The other goal is that we're going to be coming in and developing space to where there's little to no iteration of value in that 2 square inches, because it's 2 inches tall, 1 inch wide. It's a small enough space, we can get it pretty even. Okay, so I've filled the space, but I haven't really started to push any sort of real pressure yet. There's a couple of options here. This is a chamois, sort of just a microfiber cloth. And then this is another tool that we can use to soften our marks. Sort of just a paper, pencil. Some people call it a tortillon, some people call it a blending stump. Either way, it's going to be helpful for us. So I'm going to use this blending stump first. I'm going to come in directly on top of my value. And I'm actually using a little bit more pressure now, just to get a base layer. I'm trying to come at different angles as well. I don't want to get any sort of vertical or horizontal movement. Okay, now that I have a decent cover, I'm going to come back in. I'm going to start pushing fairly firmly. The main reason we just do this is so that you're not building from the tone of the page. You're actually building value from about a medium value. That's where I'm at right now. But as I start to add more pressure, I'm going to be making small circles and then pushing more pressure in from different angles. So again, I'm using my deepest value, my 9B. Your pencil set might not go up to a 9B. Just use your highest B. The trick here is progressive adding, not trying to do it in one pass. Try and do it in one pass, you're going to very possibly crease your page, and then you develop weird shimmers and sort of highlights. The light won't read as well on certain types of graphite when you put too much pressure, and kind of mess up the grid of the paper. All right. Softening, small circles. Pretty close to my deepest value. I could probably push it just a little bit darker. We're getting close. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and develop space from, once again, my lightest value to my darkest value. But I'm not going to try and do this all at once, because I think that would be a little bit ridiculous. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my chamois. I'm going to start working this value into that next quadrant, continuing to soften this. And this very possibly will pull some of the value out of my deepest value here. That's okay. I'm not going to worry about that yet, because I can come back and redarken. But I'm actually going to pull this all the way across and try to develop the lightest value I can in this first section, just from the medium here that I'm pulling, loading this, pulling it straight across. You can use a tissue, a paper towel, or a little microfiber cloth like this. But pretty quickly, I can get a very, very light value here that I can see a difference between this and this section. Now it's going to get lighter here. Obviously, that is not finished yet, but I've attempted to get my first transition on the lighter side. Okay, so now I'm going to keep adding. Using my 9B, I'm going to come back in, because I used that chamois. It did pull some of this medium out. So I'm just coming back to redarken. Now I'm going to push into this one. So the biggest thing I'm going to try and do here is, even if I push into my next quadrant, it's not the end of the world, because this is definitely not as dark as it needs to be. Using a medium value and starting to push. Soften with either blending stump or chamois, which helps reduce the amount of negative space around my marks. Makes it a lot easier to see a sort of flat value. I'm going to come right back in, start adding more value. Progressively build this up to that deeper space. And get that next transition. I do not think that's dark enough yet. This is probably light enough. I can come in and try and add this here. Once again, just with my blending stump, not even bringing any sort of real value in there. You can soften. So you can pretty easily make mark making without even putting your pencil down. Just dragging medium that you already have on the page with a little bit of pressure. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and transfer from my deepest value to my lightest value. I'm going to try and make each transition a 10% transition. I think the easiest way of doing this is working from the outside in. So I've developed my deepest value. I'm going to go second deepest value. I've developed my lightest value, second lightest value. I'm going to slowly, progressively get lighter, slowly, progressively get darker. Using graphite, using a series of different pencils. Some people will use 3 pencils, some people will use 5 pencils. Don't use the 9B all the way through. Obviously, that's your darkest pencil. That's going to make your job a lot harder. So use your variety of pencils, get an HB in there for your central value, and build up a couple different Bs. All right, so I've finished my graphite grayscale and I'm ready to start my charcoal grayscale. As far as my graphite, it's not perfect, but I did attempt to try and get it as accurate as possible. Might be some similarities here in the centralized area. If it took a little bit more time, I could probably push them out more accurately. And there are some minor mark making techniques that I could try and soften further to try and get a softer build of value. Once again, this one's a couple years old, but this one is taking a little bit more time on. Really nice value transitions as you break through, individual breaks as you go. Okay, moving on to charcoal. So I've done the same thing. I've taped off my second grayscale. I'm gonna be getting my charcoal out. I'm gonna be starting once again from my deepest value, and I'm going to be using a chamois and a blending stump to once again help me in my attempt to soften value. One thing to think about is going from graphite to charcoal is fine with a blending stump. Once you get charcoal on a blending stump, it is very difficult to then go back to graphite without reworking or trying to reduce some of this space because the charcoal will stain your drawing. So coming in right away, one of the great things about charcoal, it's nice and dark, nice and quickly. Coming with a fair amount of pressure. Okay, one thing about charcoal you need to be careful about, the tape really, really helps with charcoal. I'm just gonna be using my finger here to soften mostly, is the fallout. All of this powder that if you're not careful will go all over your drawing. So I am trying to be pretty careful here at the beginning to get that deepest value developed. Once again, one of the great things about charcoal, you can get that deep value nice and quickly. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take my finger with all this residual charcoal, I'm gonna drag it across, and I'm gonna keep going. So one thing we know is that these will all be darker than the value that we have. But getting a start value can be very helpful, especially when building that deepest value on top, or deeper value on top. So one thing I'm going to attempt to do is try and get the lightest value here. I already want a little bit dark. That's okay. Use the chamois first to try and soften it out. Take the eraser, clean up that lightest value that's still the tone of the page. And we're not bad. Almost matching on this section. Same thing, I'm going to be building from this section in, this section in, starting from the lightest and darkest, moving my way towards the center. All right, the last section is going to be hatching and cross-hatching. Conceptually, I think it's a little bit more difficult, but actually within practice, it's pretty easy. So if you take a look at this one here, you'll notice that the lighter values, obviously on the left still, darker values on the right. But it's a little bit of an illusion. The marks are the same value all the way through. We only perceive these to be darker because there is less negative space in between those marks. So I'm going to be using the liner again, that artist liner pen. And if you have one, I'd recommend using that. If not, you can still use a pencil. Try your best to keep your value the same throughout as far as line quality. Once again, I'm going to be using hatching and cross-hatching. I'm going to try and emulate this. I'll show you one that you can use mark making as well. So the first one is still going to be the page value. The second one is really just going to be a couple marks. Might be okay. The next one is going to be a few more. The next one will be a few more. I do not recommend coming in and trying to do math for this or anything like that. It's more of just a visual. Good. I'm going to be doing this all the way up to my deepest value. So notice that those look about the same. So I'm going to do, come across, add a few more. Good. Let's keep on rolling. So all I'm doing is densening how many lines I have. That space visually is going to become darker. One recommendation on this is that you can always add more. And to get the darkest value, you have to go pretty dense. You really don't want any space in between your marks. So even how I'm doing this now, I would want it even more dense than this. So starting to build that space up fairly early can be a really good way of seeing that value as well. You can also add tape to the outside of these to keep you from going out of those lines. Sometimes those stray hands. You have this really intricate drawing you don't want to mess up, and then you've got like a little fuzzy space at the end, no good. But as I continue to build this up, you'll notice that I'm sort of just going in arbitrary directions and building up value, because in the long run, we are going for something as dark as this, all the way through. Once again, the line weight stays the same, but the density of that line, how many there are in each space, is added every time. To where at the end, there's little to no negative space in between those lines. This concludes the demo video for the grayscale portion of this assignment. Once again, keep in mind each one is graphite, charcoal, mark making. You can either use hatching and cross hatching, or you can use some sort of scribble tone. The next video, we are going to be talking about shading our spheres, which is the second half of this assignment that is at the bottom portion of this page. Stay tuned.